I'm Keaton Fletcher, an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at Colorado State University.
And I'm Mariana Arvon, an organizational psychologist who specializes in organization and talent development.
And this is Healthy Work. All right, and welcome back to another episode of Healthy Work. I'm so excited to be joined by an amazing guest today who recently published a really cool paper in the Journal of Business and Psychology. I will get out of the way and let you introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Justin Weinhardt. I'm an associate professor at the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. I did my PhD in industrial organizational psychology at Ohio University in 2012, and then I moved up to Canada, and I love living here. And generally, my research focuses on motivation and decision making over time, and increasingly, I've been examining how mental health is affected by work or how people with various different mental health conditions navigate the work environment. And generally, I'm just very interested in how employees and how people manage their attention, motivation, their engagement on a daily basis, and how organizations can help employees be their best selves at work.
I think this is so cool. And it really aligns nicely, obviously, with the paper that you published in JBP recently on the experience of, ADHD in the workplace. And I would love it if you could give us a quick overview of that paper.
Yeah, sure. So, a thing that I think is maybe most unique about the study is that it is actually about people with ADHD at work. And that is a rare topic in the field of management in organizational psychology. And so, what we did in this study is we tracked about roughly 200 employees for 8 days, examining their ADHD symptoms, their level of engagement, and also how they modified their work environment to better help manage their symptoms. So we really wanted to understand, how do daily ADHD symptoms fluctuate? Do they fluctuate from day to day, or do things stay the same? And also looking more at the clinical psychology literature, we found that people, especially adults with ADHD, they have found ways to help navigate their distraction symptoms and have developed their own compensatory behaviors. And so we thought, okay, in the workplace, how do people actually do that? And so what we found is that, one, yes, ADHD symptoms do actually fluctuate from day to day. They don't just stay the same. And we also found that on days when symptoms were a little bit lower, employees with ADHD actually engaged in what are called job crafting behaviors, which is just very simply people proactively navigating and changing their work environment to better suit their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so in our study, we found that employees with ADHD, that when they engaged in taking on actually more tasks and responsibilities, when they actually reached out for more opportunities to engage in skill variety or have more autonomy about how they did their job and how they actually made their job more fun. So when people actually changed and kind of designed their job to be a more fun, playful experience, this helped reduce the negative effect of ADHD symptoms on engagement. And so this really gives a lot of power and autonomy to people with ADHD, that they have the expertise and skills to be able to change their work environment and change how they do work to better suit their needs and to then overall stay more engaged and perform better.
I think this is such important work in a variety of ways. So, first of all, thank you for doing this work. I think as ADHD becomes more and more discussed and something that I think people more visibly are talking about on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, the toolkits for how to navigate ADHD are varied and not always empirically supported, right? It's just anecdotally from my experience. And what I think is really cool about this paper is that you're bringing, the science to this of these certain strategies on days when your symptoms are higher or lower are more effective at helping facilitate engagement. And that's something that is, I think, sorely needed in the popular discourse, at the very least, around experiencing ADHD. And I also love the idea of really focusing on the experience at work, right? When, you spend a third of your life working, if not more. It's wild that we don't talk about this incredibly common psychological experience in the workplace nearly as much as we should. And so, I was kind of curious, and just while you were talking too, about the fluctuation of ADHD symptoms, if we could dive in just a little bit into that. What comes to mind first, because I am by no means a clinical psychologist, I've done no research on neurodiversity. And so I, I feel like a novice in this domain. But what comes to mind is a conversation I was having with Alyssa McGonigal about her book on chronic health conditions and disability, thinking about like spoon theory. And some days you have more spoons to use on tasks throughout the day. And for some reason, you have more resources or fewer resources. Your symptoms are higher or lower through like a chronic health perspective. And that was like the framework I brought to this. What does, symptom variability really look like for ADHD?
Well, first of all, thank you for all those kind words. And I think the spoon analogy is great. And I wish I had it for our paper, because that's what we found when examining the clinical literature, that there is starting to emerge this research stream of looking at variability in ADHD symptoms, both for adolescents and also for adults. And what we find is that things really just don't stay the same from day to day. And that can be for a variety of reasons. That can be influenced by medication, by just natural physiological changes, but also by the work environment. So things that are happening in the workplace can both help and hinder somebody with ADHD. And then what we wanted to study is how people can take ownership over their own management of these symptoms and navigate that work environment. And so we actually framed what we termed attentional control as a personal resource. So this idea that definitely that people can kind of take in this personal resource of how our attention is allocated to certain tasks or how easily we can get disrupted. And that has a large influence on our engagement, our enjoyment of work, also our overall productivity. And so I think this framing of ADHD as a aspect of, on some days I might be experiencing less or more symptoms, so that could be more inability to sit still during meetings, more easily distracted by competing tasks. So maybe on certain days the email inbox coming in is just too attractive of an alternative option to put attention towards, instead of the tasks that you're supposed to be working on. And what we also then found is that it seems like people with ADHD, they are able to notice what is going on and then adapt and change their work environment because they are aware of what's going on.
I think that's really cool and resonates to some degree with me as someone who doesn't have ADHD, or at least not diagnosed ADHD. Of like, there are just days when I find it so much harder to focus on work for I don't know what reason. And then there are days when like I can get in the zone really easy. I can pound out a bunch of different tasks. And recognizing that about myself took time. And rather than just like beating myself up for not being able to focus on the days where I can, I'm like, oh, okay, this is one of those days. Let me just do some of like the faster, easier, lighter tasks. And then the days where I'm like, oh, I think I could focus pretty well today. Okay, let me schedule some more deep work tasks. And so that kind of sounds like, in a more intentional way, what you're finding in your sample. Is that fair?
Yes, and I think although our study was with people who were diagnosed with ADHD, I think our findings and what we can learn from this is applicable to everyone. And I think that's definitely true, that there's just certain days that we maybe more feel like we're in this flow state where we can get lots of things done. We kind of immerse ourselves into a certain task. And then on other days, it just seems like we're constantly going to the phone or bursting into other colleagues' offices to also distract them. And this likely occurs more for people with ADHD, but I think it's a problem that we all face. And I mean, especially as technologically interconnected we are, particularly at work, where we use our phones, we use the computer, there's lots of opportunities to be distracted. This problem is likely even worse for those with ADHD. And I guess then the kind of nice, hopeful message is people with ADHD have figured out ways to balance and navigate their work environment. And we have something that everybody can learn from that. And so I think that's a really important message that we found in this research.
That's so cool. And it makes me wonder too then about like other mental health issues and how they intersect with the workplace and what we can learn, from populations that are facing mental health concerns while at work. And I know that you have other work in this arena. It's not really the main paper we're talking about, but I was wondering, like, what do we know about mental health and work?
Well, I mean, one of the things I guess that is unfortunate that we know is that one, work can contribute to negative mental health and also positive mental health, but things like role overload, long work hours can have severe consequences on mental health, on cardiovascular health, on overall mortality. But then we also know that the workplace can be a positive intervention in people's lives that provides meaning and social support and social interaction. Obviously, also money is important. And so there's this kind of tension that both work can contribute positively to mental health and negatively to mental health. And particularly in the realm of ADHD, you find that the very small amount of research on ADHD at work generally is framed as a negative, that people with ADHD have increased number of absences at work, they have lower productivity, they're more likely to be unemployed for longer periods of time than people without ADHD. And so this research project, what we wanted to do is slightly try and flip that to not have such a negative perspective about ADHD at work and show that people are modifying their work environment to better suit them to deal with this drop in engagement that happens because of ADHD symptoms. And this kind of motivation was really driven, and I want to call out my co-author of Sammy Young, where she really wanted to push a different perspective than what was currently going on in the literature about ADHD, and particularly ADHD at work. And I think this aspect of stigma is then also pervasive. I found in some other research that my lab and co-authors we've done about ways that mental health disclosure can be fostered in the workplace. So we recently published an additional study looking at what are the organizational factors that increase the likelihood that employees will disclose mental health concerns at work. And specifically, we find that when employees perceive that discussing mental health is not stigmatized, that the organization talks about and provides resources towards employees when they do disclose mental health, and that overall there's a high perception of social support around mental health and mental health disclosure. So it's a topic that is talked about at work, and people aren't afraid to bring this up, and particularly leaders and executives openly discuss these, create an environment that makes it more likely to disclose the issues that individuals are having, where then they can receive more benefits and receive more organizational support overall.
Outstanding. And so one of the questions that I really like to ask is like, what do we do with this? And I think that your research, both the paper on ADHD and the paper you just talked about, have a lot of like very clear practical implications. So let's start with like, if I am someone with ADHD, what are you telling me to do with my workday? Like, how can I improve in a science-backed way?
So, as always, it's only one study, but I do think that there, as you mentioned, there are some important implications for both managers and employees with ADHD. And one of the aspects that we found that wasn't helpful for managing the relationship between ADHD symptoms and engagement was what's called decreasing hindering demands. And this generally just means decreasing your workload. And this has actually been found generally in research that this doesn't always help. And this fits in with an idea of when you engage and you're actively engaging in a task, it can help spur on that motivation. And so we found that what actually helped more was changing up the tasks that you're doing, having more of a perspective of trying to create more fun in your work, kind of like reframing how you do your work. In this literature, there's an example of somebody saying that as a waitress, they would sometimes think of themselves at work as a ballerina to just make work seem more fun and enjoyable when things were stressful. Those things worked better than just taking on the idea of, I'm going to do less work today. So I think when there maybe people are struggling and they're feeling very distracted, the maybe implicit belief is to pull away a bit. But actually, we found that when people try and change how they do tasks rather than not do the tasks, that worked better.
That's so fun. I love the story about the ballerina. How cool. Then too, I mean, that's surprising to me. Was there anything else that like surprised you while doing this research?
So I think definitely the most surprising was the variability in ADHD symptoms. And then truly that was also our kind of surprising finding. One of the things that maybe surprised us that didn't work as strongly was the kind of increasing social connection, where reaching out to colleagues for more help and support, we didn't find that to be an effective strategy in our study. But I think that overlaps with some of the other research I've been doing about mental health disclosure, that you need to be in a work environment that can support those types of conversations. And I think if that is present, then maybe reaching out to some colleagues to getting some additional support for navigating the work environment can be beneficial. But overall, I think the thing that just surprised me the most is that really people are, maybe this actually wasn't surprising me, I knew this, but it's like people are the best experts of their own life. And when they're given the autonomy and space to navigate and change their work environment themselves, they do figure ways to cope. And so I think, for leaders and managers, it's about creating the safe space that these topics can be discussed, mental health can be discussed, obtaining resources, whether that's, therapy benefits, whatnot, discussing those in the workplace is really helpful. But I think it's also equally helpful to understand that the person themselves, they're often the best person to know how they can work more effectively. So I think managers, when interacting with employees and identifying struggles, it's what do the person themselves, what do they think? How can they improve their work? How can they change their work? What tasks and the way that they complete those tasks is best for them will lead to the best overall engagement and productivity. And I think, especially when employees have a voice about how they navigate their work environment and how they can change their work environment, this really has a positive effect.
I love that you started out with saying that's surprising, but then like not actually surprising because I think that is exactly the right way to frame that of, once you say that out loud that, we are experts in ourselves and, we want to do well at work. I think people are motivated to create and to do things. And we all find our own ways of navigating that when given the space to. It makes sense when you hear it, but it's so counter to the narrative of, like, the need for a company to have such tight control and limit the options and distractions for employees so everyone's doing exactly what they should be doing 100% of the time in the way that the company thinks that they ought to be. Like, that's the prevailing narrative, I think, in sort of culture, and if you let people just sort of do what they will, they won't work, and I just don't believe that. And I think that your data sort of back up, like if we can give people autonomy to design their work in a way where it works for them, then they're going to be the most productive. And I think, broadly across the OHP literature, we see the same sort of effect of like giving people autonomy around how and when and where they work largely is associated with positive outcomes for everyone, not just for the people, but for the company. And putting it again, in this specific context of ADHD makes so much sense because one's experience of ADHD might not be the exact same as someone else's. And so the same supports or the same structure that works for one person might not work for the other, but they can both get to the same level of productivity probably with their own unique tailoring of their experiences. And I just think that trusting people to like want to do a good job is so important. And, working with them to create those guardrails or to create like whatever structure is needed, but like still providing enough autonomy is so important. And I just love that you framed it as like surprising, but then not at all surprising because like, absolutely.
Yes, and I mean, actually, to your point about where maybe some things work for some others, one of the things that we were surprised that maybe this didn't work was a concept called designing competition, where people turn work into a self competition. So, yesterday I got through this, 150 lines of code, say, and so now today I want to do 200 lines of code. I don't actually know if that's a large or a small amount, but let's assume that's how much people code in a day. And, it's like, oh, can I beat my last performance? And if I can slightly extrapolate from the data we had, what we think is probably going on, and we're going to run a new study about this, is some people really seemed to do this and they were a smaller segment, but then some of the other people, this was not a very common strategy that people engaged in. And so we're still trying to think of what might be some of those individual differences where there seemed to be such a kind of divergence of some people like to do this and some people really don't like to do this. And so we want to further explain why that is, because we actually thought that would be definitely of like, oh yeah, this one's definitely going to work. This is a thing that people kind of always talk about. And it seems like there's some other reason why some people do it and some people don't. So that's something we need to explore in the future.
That's so cool. I mean, you've touched on like gamification of work in a couple of different angles. And it sounds like we know like video games or whatever, like they're highly rewarding. They're those quick dopamine hits and like it can keep your attention for a really long period of time. They're designed to do that. And so that's obviously why organizations want to gamify work. But it sounds like there's different ways to approach that gamification, just like there are different games. Like saying this out loud, surprising, but not at all surprising, of like different features of that gamification might be more effective for some people versus others. And I think that's really cool. My last question for you, Justin, is why do you do this work?
The big eternal question. Truly, I do this work because I've had this maybe almost lifelong interest, but since high school, I really wanted to study both psychology, but then how that can be practically applied to life. And so, this research in particular, I've always been fascinated by clinical psychology and mental health just in general. And particularly of this research, what really drives me is that we got to incorporate very basic psychology research and neuroscience research about ADHD, but then applying it to the workplace and examining how these ADHD symptoms come up at work and how it affects the workplace, and then how people themselves can navigate the work environment and change it. And so this study, I think, actually more than maybe a few of my other papers, really, I think, does kind of embody my researcher style of, we even sprinkled in a tinge of philosophy, a tinge of neuroscience, a little bit of applied psychology research, a little bit of mental health. And it all came together to address a very real world issue that millions of people face every day. And so that's why I did this work.
That's awesome. And I'm so glad you are. This is really important work and you do a great job. So thank you so much for your time and for being with us today.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bye. Healthy Work is a podcast written and executive produced by Keaton Fletcher and Mariana Arvon. This episode is produced, mixed, and edited by Keaton Fletcher. Artwork is by Keaton Fletcher. And our music is Zero, Microsong by Steve Combs. Please like us, follow us, and subscribe on whatever podcatching software you use. And please leave a review on the iTunes store. It really does help get us out there.